Major General Jeffrey Amherst's plan for the summer of 1759 was threefold. An army of regulars under General John Prideaux, augmented by Native Americans and provincials, would strike at the French fortress on the Niagara River. Amherst would personally lead an army against Fort Niagara, and James Wolfe, hero of the campaign of 1758, would sail an army from Louisbourg to the gates of Quebec. Perhaps no place on that list was as strategically important as Fort Niagara. Although not as impressive as Quebec or as well known as Carillon, Niagara would be critical to the fate of French colonial ambitions. Located at the western edge of Lake Ontario, it was the last major French stronghold on the Great Lakes. Following the surrender of Fort Frontenac the previous summer, Niagara became even more important for French efforts in the Ohio Valley. The fortress had been strengthened over the near 40 years of its existence from a fur outpost and Jesuit mission to a fully committed military base. During the spring of 1759, Engineer Captain Pierre Pouchot of the Béarn Regiment was sent to Niagara to help improve the fortifications there. Accompanying him were nearly 3,000 men. Most of these soldiers were then sent to the Ohio Valley to raid British settlements and forts during the summer. This left Pouchot with about 700 troops and local Indian allies to man Fort Niagara by late June. It was also in late June that the British Army, over 3,000 men strong, arrived at the ruins of Fort Oswego. They had landed at the site of one of Britain's worst humiliations in the Great War for Empire. In 1756, Pierre Pouchot had helped lay the siege lines, which demolished Oswego and captured its garrison. Whether General John Prideaux knew it or not, the subsequent siege of Niagara would be a sweet revenge. Leaving Oswego on the first day of July, Prideaux and his army sailed the entire 150 miles to Niagara without being detected. Their fleet anchored in a marsh on the 6th of July, and the army began disembarking. The following day, Pouchot realized what was happening and began putting the fort in order to withstand a siege. The British engineers attached to the project soon realized that the fort was far better constructed than anything they'd faced in America. The stone fortifications which they now were faced with were totally unheard of in the wilderness. The largest cannons that they'd brought, 18-pounders, were totally unsuited to fracture the walls in any significant way. By this point, Pouchot had sent word to the French settlements in the Ohio and Illinois valleys to have their troops retreat to Niagara. If Niagara were to surrender, all of the Ohio and Illinois forts would be cut off from Quebec and would fall like dominoes. In spite of reservations about the artillery, the British began to dig trenches. This they did with great thoroughness, and within 2 weeks they were within 100 yards of the fort. However, this came with 3 associated problems. The men were now exhausted, having worked throughout the night and being sniped at by Frenchmen during the day. On July 19th, Prideaux's second-in-command had been shot and killed. Just over an hour later, Prideaux himself would die, decapitated by a mortar he had accidentally stepped in front of. This vacuum in command was the last thing that the British needed, so an unlikely candidate stepped in. Sir William Johnson, a trader and British Indian agent, politicked himself into a command position. Although he held no real regular military rank, he had brought nearly 1,000 Iroquois warriors to the siege, and the British officers had no objection to his power play. For the next 4 days, the British concentrated their cannon fire on the side of the fort facing Lake Ontario. The French walls began to crumble. But on the 23rd of July, a native runner arrived in Niagara, bearing news that the French forces in the Ohio Valley were returning to break the siege. Pouchot, of course, was overjoyed to have any relief at all. His men were exhausted, and the fort's magazine was almost out of ammunition. However, the native messenger had mixed loyalties, to put it mildly. This courier had also stopped in the British camp. Of course, Sir William Johnson was now well aware that the French column was coming down the river road and had taken every precaution possible. He ordered his troops to fell logs to provide a small measure of cover. The natives had been requested to stay out of the battle, and that they should relay as such to the French allied Indians. This upcoming battle would be fought almost exclusively between regulars. Marine Captains François Lignery and Captain Charles Aubry were shocked when the natives announced that they would not support the drive to the fort. But the two had a mission to fulfill. As they led their men into the clearing of La Belle Famille, just a mile south of Fort Niagara, they had no idea they were walking into a trap. The 46th Foot sprang up from their position behind felled logs and delivered a shattering volley as the French advanced into close range. The militia and French Marines attempted to get into battle line, but were disrupted by the firing of the British. Finally, the Iroquois, seeing who had come out on top, charged with tomahawk and war club at the French. Lignery's column collapsed, with almost all of his surviving men running back towards the river road and their canoes. Lignery himself was wounded and captured, as was Aubry. The British pursued the French as far as 5 miles south before returning to their camp. The following day, a truce was called. The wounded Captain Lignery was brought into the fort and explained the situation to Pouchot. On the 26th of July, the French garrison marched out of the fort into captivity. New France's lifeline to the west had been severed.